Okay. Hello, everyone. Today is July 25th, and we are starting the first special class of the course States of Exception in Theory and Practice, organized by me, Professor Antônio Gasparetto Júnior, as part of Global July 2023, promoted by Federal University of Juiz de Fora. I am very proud to receive today Professor Matthias Lemke with the special class State of Exception, What It Means Today. Professor Matthias Lemke studied political science, modern history, and sociology at the University of Münster in Germany, where he obtained a master's degree in political science. Having obtained another master's degree in Pensée politique at Sciences Po Paris in France, he published his PhD thesis in 2008 on the concept of violence in the social democratic discourse between 1870 and 1930 in France and Germany. His habilitation was on the state of exception in representative democracies. He worked as a professor for political science at the German Federal University of Applied Administrative Sciences, and after that, became the founder of an independent consulting agency for democratic government in crisis situation. Professor Matthias Lemke, thank you for accepting the invitation and welcome. Let me add you, Professor Matthias Lemke. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Welcome, and we are looking forward to listen to you. So the time is all yours now.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio, for these kind words of introduction. And thank you very much for having me here with you. I regret that I cannot be with you actually in Brazil today. I'm right now sitting here in Germany. It's some sort of 8 p.m. in the evening, and the sun is at least still shining, as I hope it is with you in Brazil. What I would like to do with you today, and when I talked with Antonio about the conception of what we should discuss today on the state of exception, I came across this title that you can see on the screen right now, State of Exception, What It Means Today. And I would, before I get started, very briefly like to warn you, because one might consider this title of some sort of giving answers to questions about state of exception. And I'm afraid it's quite the opposite. As Antonio mentioned, I studied political science and pensée politique in Paris in 2002, 2003. And there I came across Bernard Manin and Pasquale Pasquino, who were then at that time very intensively working on state of exception policies. And visiting their lectures some sort of intrigued me and got me into this topic. So on the one hand, I have some sort of a 20-year experience on working on state of exception. That's the good news. The bad news is that the more I look into it, the more questions I get. So this would be the first introductory remark. Don't expect too many answers, but expect some questions. The second introductory remark, if I may, is that what I want to share with you today is some sort of a political theory approach, political science approach that is not necessarily a legal approach, a constitutional approach, but it is some sort of state of, it's some sort of a political science perspective trying to figure out what state of exception means and what it is and how one can observe it. So what do I want to do today? Actually, I brought some 3 questions and some sort of a conclusion with me. I'd like to talk about what does state of exception mean. I, after that, want to share with you some thoughts on where state of exception came from. Why do we have it today in so many countries, in so many constitutions? And third question then, when we have it, we normally use it, as we have seen during the corona pandemic. So the question is, how is it going with state of exception when we apply it in our democracies? And the last point I'd like to talk about is some sort of conclusions or various perspectives or some other questions that did not fit into the other 3 chapters actually of the talk. So let's get right into it. In the very first part, I'd like to talk about some contemporary definitions of state of exception. And before I show you the very first slide, I'd like to invite you to reflect for a second on when you perhaps read your very first paper or 3rd or 2nd or 4th paper, I don't know, some academic texts on state of exception. Who is the very author that you always find in there? And I brought this author with me today. It's, of course, and obviously, Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt is a German legal scholar who became known during the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich in Germany for his legal expertise and his legal work. And Carl Schmitt is a figure which is highly contested as well for his positions. And what is important for us today is that in nearly any study on state of exception, you will find Carl Schmitt gets cited. But the problem is, what does he have to say about state of exception? Is there anything he can add to the debate? And therefore, I wanted to share 2 sentences from him with you. And the very first one is here in the original language in German, is the most notorious sentence in all work on state of exception, certainly. I think you have another talk tomorrow. Let's see if Naomi will present that sentence as well. But the sentence goes, souverän ist, wer über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet, meaning sovereign is who decides on whether there is a state of exception or not. The second sentence that I brought with me is, that one was from 1922, as you can see. The other one is from 1926. That's all in the very early stages of the Weimar Republic, the very first democracy in Germany. And the second sentence might seem a little bit astonishing, especially from a perspective of democratic theory or post-democracy theory, which states that the controversy is the very essence of democracy. So we have different opinions, different points of view. Therefore, we have to negotiate, have to find a compromise, and in the end, we'll get a decision and therefore a solution to a given problem in a democracy. What Schmitt says here is quite the opposite. He says that, well, to a democracy, it's important to have some sort of homogeneity. And if necessary, democracy has to get rid of any kind of heterogeneity. Meaning, his understanding of democracy is some sort of an Unitarian perspective. He thinks democracy is one people, is one meaning, is one direction, but it's not a plurality of perspectives, one might say. So what is in there? In these 2 sentences, we have the notion of sovereignty understood as some sort of the highest power in the state, meaning the one who decides on whether or not rules apply is the sovereign. And therefore, this sentence, actually, this very first sentence, and I think that's one of the greatest misunderstandings in many, many texts on state of exception, this sentence is not about state of exception, but it's about sovereignty. Sovereign is the one who has the highest power to define whether or not rules apply. And the other sentence aims at a very famous notion also coming from Schmitt, stating that the essence of the political is the distinction between friend and enemy. And therefore, once you can distinguish between friend and enemy, you have to get rid of that enemy. You have to eradicate that enemy. And therefore, these 2 notions together aim at a very Unitarian state, a state that is in its very core understanding anti-liberal, anti-pluralistic, and therefore is oriented against the democracy we saw during the Weimar Republic. So if you want, one could say that being faced with the first democratic attempts in Germany in the 20th century during the Weimar Republic, Schmidt was not a defender of that democracy, but he adopted an anti-liberal and a very authoritarian position. So even though he is cited very often in the context of state of emergency, state of exception, I think he does not contribute to the matter. He does not contribute to better understanding state of exception in a theoretical or even in an empirical perspective. So I now mentioned Carl Schmitt. I did what anyone has to do in a paper or a presentation that is about state of exception. But I think then we can leave him now alone and have a look at some other approaches that might allow us some more insights on what state of exception might be. I brought here with me a definition from Bernard Manin, which was one of my professors at the Sciences Po in Paris in 2002, 2003. And Bernard Manin wrote a paper in 2015 that was in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Paris from the 13th of November in 2015. And then this citation reads that the institutions of acceptance allow to get rid for a certain period of time from some constitutional norms if the situation requires it. So what is in that definition? I think in this definition we can find some three elements actually. What Bernard Manin says is that the authorization of the state of exception accords or sticks to certain constitutional rules. And these rules say whether or not one might abstain from the application of certain, for example, fundamental rights during a certain time. A state of exception requires given circumstances, which one might translate to a crisis situation, a severe crisis that goes over the capacities of crisis management in normal times. And the third element, I will come back to that later when we go to the theory or history of ideas chapter of the presentation. He sees that there is a time limit for a state of exception. That means that the derogation from certain rules is always limited in time, which you find, for example, in sunset clauses that are integrated in the Constitution, saying that, for example, a state of exception shall not exceed 2 weeks or 30 days, which are rather common sunset clauses in that context. So these are the three elements in the definition of Bernard Manin. I brought you, if I may, my very own definition, which you can read here. And this definition, it's from a publication in 2018, also sticks to, can be reduced to three elements. That is that a state of exception refers to a multitude of different crisis reaction mechanisms. It shall enhance the government's power of action and decision-making. And its aim is to return as quickly as possible to the pre-crisis situation. Now let's figure out what that means also there. I think one can say we have three elements in the definition. The very first one is that the authorization of state of exception also sticks to certain constitutional rules. And these rules aim at enhancing the capacities of the executive in dealing with the crisis. Then the second point is Bernard Manin was talking about the circumstances. I would rather put it that way, that a state of exception can be applied once you can frame or show or plausibilize a situation as a severe crisis, which means that we don't necessarily have to have a severe crisis, but it's enough if people think that there might be a severe crisis. And the third element, which is in that definition, Also here in contrast to what we have seen with Bernard Manin, that a state of exception does not necessarily have a time limit. That means that once I'm able to say or find many or enough people to believe that a crisis is still ongoing, it wouldn't make any sense to stop with state of emergency measures, but to continue. So therefore, I would say that any state of exception has a potential for normalization in its DNA. So let's try to get these two perspectives together, if I may, very briefly. I think one can distinguish at least three dimensions that are mentioned in these two definitions. The very first one is, and I'll come to the third one, it's missing in that slide, but I'll have it later on. The very first one is the constitutional dimension or the legal dimension. Bernard Manin is talking about a derogation that's taking place during a state of exception, meaning that some fundamental rights or rules or laws are left aside for a certain period of time. So, for example, there is no fundamental right for free movement or for manifestations during a given period in a state of exception. Whereas I would say that a state of exception makes that the executive gets more competences, which also could lead in an abolition or derogation from fundamental rights. But I think the notion of a stronger executive goes even beyond that pure derogation. The second dimension is about the causes, and there one might distinguish between practical and or discursive dimension. That is, one can say there are really objective or real reasons to issue a state of exception, as I see it in Manin, where I would also agree that, yes, there are objective, real reasons to issue a state of emergency. And on the other hand, there might as well be reasons or situations that are framed or constructed in order to deliver a legitimation for having a state of exception. So what do I mean by that? Actually, I would like to very briefly introduce you to what one distinguishes in the literature when it comes to causes for state of exception. Actually, it's in the very, very vast majority of the literature, it's a binary distinction, meaning that we distinguish between man-made and non-man-made causes. So what do we have when we start with the man-made? The man-made causes for state of exception, as you can see here, is a photo taken on the 14th of July 2016 in Nice in France, after a guy went into a crowd on the 14th of July parade on the Promenade des Anglais in Nice, killing some 80 and wounding some 400 people, and got stopped with that truck then later by the police. So that would be some sort of example for man-made causes one might identify. We don't necessarily have to speak about accidents, for example, nuclear accidents, as we have seen in Chernobyl or Fukushima. One might think about civil unrest or uprising. One might think about terrorism, and already there you can see that what a cause is depends very much on the perspective. So civil unrest, is it legitimate or is it illegitimate? It depends very much on the perspective. Is a terrorist and when? Or is he a freedom fighter, or she? So there we are in a situation where it becomes crucial of who is able to define who is the enemy, and therefore language in the context of state of emergency and the establishment of state of emergency becomes a very, very important matter. I actually gave you that fourth point there, air traffic controller strike, in order to explain you a little bit more on what I mean. In 2009, we saw an air traffic controller strike in Spain. That was during the very first weekend in December 2009. And for the fight against, this air traffic controller strike in Spain, Spanish government issued a state of exception, which is called Estado de Alarma in Spanish. And therefore, one might have to consider two things. The still rather young democracy in Spain saw a very, very crucial crisis with an attempted coup in 1981 with military personnel standing in the French parliament and in the Spanish parliament and firing at the members of parliament. And in that situation, which was right after the Spanish democracy came into being after Franco and the regime of Franco, Spain refrained from issuing a state of exception. So there was a profound crisis and they didn't use it. On the other hand, then in 2009, there was this air traffic controller strike and Spanish government said, well, this strike prevents people from free movement. So the air traffic controllers, they were doing some illegal stuff against the interests of the very majority of the people. And therefore, they issued a state of exception. Although the Spanish constitution says that in a labor related in a labor related issue or in a strike situation, one might not use a state of exception. So they did it anyway. And there you see, once you can frame a situation as being a very, very intense threat to the society, you can get away with nearly anything. Let us very briefly have a look in the non-man-made causes of state of exception. What you see here is a picture actually from Hamburg, Germany in 1962, where we had the inundations in a vast majority of the city due to a flood. And that is the very situation where the former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt became famous for his crisis management. And in 1962, the German constitution did not have a state of emergency or state of exception option. The German Notstand was not yet invented. It only came in 1967. And therefore, they had to get through that on improvisation, if you want. So let's have a look. Non-man-made causes might be inundation, flood, tsunami, earthquake, wildfire, volcano eruption, or what we saw in the last 2 to 3 years, a pandemic. So here I think it's much more hard to intervene on a linguistic level and, let's say, talk about an inundation or a flood or an earthquake if that did not occur. So there you would have, in my opinion, a more or less objective set of causes that trigger a state of exception, whereas on the other side, especially when it comes to terrorism, civil unrest, uprising, manifestations, etc., the situation of legitimizing state of exception gets much more complicated. And then this is that binary distinction between man-made and non-man-made causes for having a state of exception. I think there needs to be a third one, and this is very, very often missing. I got you that photo. This is from the Marshall Islands. And the Marshall Islands, which might not be commonly known, have had states of emergency nearly ongoing, uninterrupted since 2008. And these state of exceptions are related to the consequences of the climate change. For example, when drinking water is vanishing, when the coastline is eroding, etc. So therefore, they had this ongoing state of exception due to climate change related issues on the Marshall Islands. And therefore, I would suggest that one should add a third, let's say, group of causes, that is climate change related issues triggering states of exception. Climate change related issues as a hybrid category, because one might wonder if, let's say, for example, the loss of land on the island in the Southern Pacific region, of course, that is some sort of a non-man-made crisis, but on the other hand, our way of living, mainly in the Western countries, so Europe and North America, led to these consequences. So in the end, that would be my suggestion, just to add, besides that binary distinction, a third one, which is hybrid causes for triggering state of exception policies. Coming back once again to Lemke and Manin for the last time, we were talking about the first and the second dimension. I think the third dimension one has to add is the time or temporal dimension, which is with Manin, there is a time limit, there is a sunset clause in any state of exception, whereas I would emphasize that even if there should be a time limit, a strong government, a strong executive can put it aside and go on with the state of exception as long as it wishes. And therefore, we have these three dimensions that, when they are considered together, are, in my perspective, a very interesting and good working definition. That is mainly because they allow an empirical approach to the analysis of state of exception, whether one would figure out what are the legal or the constitutional regulations for state of exceptions, whether one wanted to find out what are the causes that trigger state of exceptions and how they are justified in the political public, or whether one would try to find out how long did state of exceptions take given a certain set of causes. So that would be mainly the very first point, bringing me to the second one. So now, as we have a definition of state of exception, we have some sort of an understanding of that crisis prevention or crisis solving issue or tool. We would have to go back perhaps one step, and we should ask ourselves, where did state of exception actually come from? And therefore, I would like to have a look back with you together into the history of ideas. But before I do that, what I normally do before I give a talk, I go to Google and try to do some research on what I want to tell you. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with the Google Books Ngram Viewer, but it is some sort of a useful tool when it comes to have a frequency analysis of terms occurring in a corpus of books digitalized by Google. So Google went on and digitalized some, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 million books. And these books, you can search for notions occurring in these books. And the notion, the technical term for a notion or a word occurring in a corpus is an n-gram. An entity, for example, with 2 words would be a b-gram. With 3 words would be a 3-gram, etc., etc. So I typed in here the notion of state of exception, state of emergency, and the notion of dictatorship. And what you can see is that the notion of dictatorship obviously has a broader meaning than state of emergency, state of exception. It has been used from 1789 to our days, and started rising very much in the early 1900s and coming to a very high point in the 1930s, and then resting on a very high level compared to the other two notions. State of emergency obviously is the notion that is more used in the English corpus of Google Books compared to state of exception. Nonetheless, both terms occur in the 1920s of the 20th century. And state of emergency here having some sort of a peak in the 1990s. One can look, you can see it here. I'm not sure if you can see the mouse, but at the very bottom of the table, you can see here some years that are shown. And when you click on these years, you can see the texts that were scanned by Google. So you can go into the text and have a look where the term actually was used. What I wanted to stress by that is that, yeah, one might have the expectation or the impression that a state of exception is a very young term, a technical term from the 1920s, from say some 100 years old. But that is not true. So in order to understand where a state of exception comes from, we have to go back some 2,500 years, and we'll have to look into the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, some sort of a differentiated statehood in the Mediterranean, did know the office of the dictator. And the dictator was an extraordinary magistrate that had special powers, unless these powers were not unlimited. Once the dictator was in office, he was a single person magistrate, which means that in a time span where a dictator was appointed, that meant a deviation from the principle of collegiality, which was normally the typical constitution for magistrates in the Roman Republic, meaning there was always two of them. Third point for the dictator, and there you can see where Bernard Manin got his time limit idea from. The office of the dictatorship was limited to 6 months. You can find that in Cicero, where he says that a dictator, once elected, had 6 months of time to get his task done, and after that he had to stick back from the office and anything went back to normal. There were various tasks that one might find. A very common task is mentioned here, rei gerunde causa, which meant go to war. Another task was, for example, seditionis sedende causa, which meant to deal with civil uprisings. The office of dictatorship was used for approximately 85 times from the 5th to the 2nd century before our time. And then something very strange happened. Sulla became dictator in 82, in the 1st century before our time. And this dictatorship had the task of legibus faciendis and re republicae constituende causa, which means some sort of giving laws and getting back the republic from an institutional and legal point of view. So he had the office, as you can see, for approximately 3 years. Then he resigned on his own free will. And there you can see already one point, he was dictator longer than it was foreseen by the tradition of law in the Roman Republic, which said with Cicero 6 months, and he had the office for 3 years. So what you see is that once you become dictator, once you have this power in your hands, it's some sort of intriguing that you try to get it longer than it was foreseen. His dictatorship was based on the Lex Valeria, which granted him constitutional and legislative power. And also this Lex Valeria is contested in itself, whether or not it was legal to be introduced and adopted. But I think the important point is here that there was some sort of a law trying to legitimize Sulla in his office as a dictator, saying that this dictator is a legal figure. He is a figure as it is foreseen by the constitution, and therefore he is legitimate. Where on the other hand, one could say, well, a dictator could also be considered to be a tyrant, being above the law or beyond the law, or not being relied to any law at all. And that is a picture that one wanted clearly to avoid in this situation. So Sulla was dictator for some 3 years. And then after him came Julius Caesar. And Caesar became in 49 what is called Dictator Perpetuo Republicae Constituende Causa. And the most important notion here is perpetuo. That means he is dictator for lifetime, without having to hand back the power invested in him on a certain day. And therefore, the dictatorship with Caesar became normality, one might say. After Caesar's death, you can see here the assassination of Caesar on the picture, after Caesar's death, no dictator was appointed anymore in the Roman Republic or in Rome, saying that actually the institution dictatorship that was there for saving the institutions, in saving Rome, led to its destruction. So what we see in the Roman Republic with the institution and the magistrate of dictatorship is that we have there the very idea to concentrate the power of the executive in the hands of one single person in a crisis situation in order to have the person dealing with that crisis. And after the Roman Republic, we for a long time did not hear anything anymore about dictatorship until 1530. And in 1530, we saw the publication of two major books, or 1530, 1531, of two major books of Niccolo Machiavelli, which the one you certainly know and you've certainly read is The Prince. And this citation here is taken from the discourses on Livy. So this is the book where Machiavelli tries to analyze and draw his conclusions from his understanding of the Roman history and Roman Republic. And what Machiavelli there basically says is, I try to highlight that a little bit, is that actually at cities, as it is here in this citation, that cities, or one might also say republics, that do not know to use a dictatorship in a situation of severe crisis will vanish from earth. So as he puts it here, a dictatorship for him once again becomes an important tool for survival for the Republic. And there it is again, from the Roman Republic, introduced into the Italian Renaissance by Machiavelli, and therefore the notion of dictatorship became transferred to modern times and into our modern political, or one should perhaps better say, political realistic thinking. That went on with another author, John Locke. You have certainly heard and read of him as well. And he did not use the notion of dictatorship or dictator, but what he introduced was a certain sort of power. Actually, we know all the separation of powers as from Montesquieu, which is the executive, legislative, and judicative branch. And here with John Locke, we also have the executive, the legislative, and then there is some sort of the federative power, which is responsible for the foreign relations of a state. And this is here the case, the so-called prerogative. And the prerogative power is for situations that are unforeseeable, that are not really regulated by law already, that are, let's say, some sort of critical with regard of the time frame they pose. The reaction has to be rather imminent. So therefore, a situation or a force that allows the government to deal with crisis situation, that makes crisis reaction more quickly and more efficient. This is called then the prerogative, and might be, let's say, the functional equivalent to the dictatorship that we have seen in Machiavelli. This still goes on. As you can see, John Locke was, let's say, some sort of the founding fathers of the liberal idea of democracy. And I brought here another text that goes even further into the heart, if you will, of modern democracy. This is a citation coming from the Federalist Papers. It's from the 8th article by Alexander Hamilton, which has two very, very important sentences. The very first one is coming from the idea that fear or the hope for safety from external danger, that this fear or this hope, depends on how you want to put it, is a very, very, very important force when it comes to structure your political environment, drawing your political decisions. And therefore, the famous sentence goes like this. You have it highlighted here in the first paragraph. To be more safe, they, that is the people living in a state, at length become willing to run the risk of being less free in order to be more safe. So the trade-off is give me more safety and I will refrain from my rights that provide me with freedom. And interestingly, the Federalist does not call it dictatorship, does not call this strengthened arm of the executive dictatorship. That would not necessarily, I think, fit into their whole idea and political agenda, but they call it monarchy. So there as well, we have this executive in the hands of one single person, different from aristocracy, different from polity, in order to use the terms that come from the Aristotelian tradition of a distinction of constitutions. So here in the Federalist, we have the idea that we have to have what they call a direction toward the monarchy that allows us to have a strengthened executive in order to be able to deal with crisis. And then there is it. Actually, the dictatorship from the Roman Republic found its very way into what we have today as modern democracies. And to end with one modern democracy that is no longer in existence, I brought you here the famous Article 48 from the Weimar Constitution. And this is also the frame of reference for Carl Schmitt, which we were talking about at the very beginning. And you have it here highlighted as well, saying that the President of the Reich might take any means deemed necessary, also with weapons, in order to maintain order. And in order to maintain order, he might as well refrain from certain fundamental rights and overthrow them. So what does that mean when we want to try to have a little bit of structure here in this very brief history of ideas as well? I think one might distinguish here again between, let's say, two variants of state of exception. The one variant is the extra-legal state of exception that we have seen in the Roman dictatorship, meaning we get rid of all the institutional regulations that we have in normal times. We establish a dictator for 6 months, he gets the job done, and after that is done, we will get back to normal. So there, in this extra-legal logic, the state of exception is something that is external to the constitutional frame. On the other hand, we have what I would call legally integrated state of exception, where the state of exception is, let's say, some sort of a constitutional instrument. And there as well, one might distinguish two, let's say, subtypes. One of these subtypes is bent towards the executive. That's also what I had in my definition in the first chapter, which is, for example, given in the Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, where it's all power vested into the hands of the Reichspräsident. But one might think of, for example, the regulation of état d'urgence in France as well. The other subtype here of the legally integrated state of exception is the one that is bent towards the legislative, meaning the parliament in a democracy. And there you have, for example, I think that's the only type that I found yet, is the German Notstand, which is some sort of state of emergency regulation introduced into the German constitution, the Grundgesetz, in 1967, which leaves the power in the parliament to decide whether or not a state of exception, a Notstand, shall be applied or not. Okay, if you permit, I'll skip Giorgio Agamben and I will come to the third chapter, when we try to define what is state of emergency, some sort of crisis reaction mechanism, where did it come from the Roman dictatorship, trying to enhance the government's or the executive's capacity in dealing with crisis. Now, let's see how it's going. What is it doing with crisis? And is it an effective tool in order to solve problems? And therefore, I brought with me some few examples. I'm not sure really if we will talk about all of them, but at least some. The first example I have brought with me here is the famous US Supreme Court case from 1944, which is Korematsu versus United States. And the frame of reference here is the Executive Order 9066 from Franklin Delano Roosevelt from February 1942. And in this executive order, Roosevelt, under the impression of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, allowed the military authority to describe areas that are at the coastlines and the West Coast, East Coast, and the military might determine persons that shall be excluded from these areas, for example, to avoid sabotage acts. What is astonishing is at least two things. First, the American Constitution, we talked about the Federalist Papers, the American Constitution does not have a state of exception. So didn't they hear or didn't they read the Federalist Papers? No, it's I think quite the contrary. When you recall what Hamilton said, he was talking about a monarchy that shall be installed, or some sort of monarchy spirit, if you want. And that is exactly what the President of the United States is in person. So there you can read in the executive order, in this introductory formula, by virtue of the authority, which is the power actually vested in me as president, I authorize, and so on and so on. So the United States do not have a state of exception. They don't need it because they have the president, and the president might issue these executive orders. The second interesting point is that although the executive order was not aimed at a specific group of people, as you can see here on the left, it was actually aimed at all persons living in the United States of Japanese ancestry, meaning that this executive order was issued and used against American citizens that were so unlucky to have Japanese parents or grandparents. And during the time from 1942 to 1944, some 100,000 to 125,000 Americans with Japanese ancestry were brought on the west coast of the United States, not on the east coast. There, this order did not apply. They were brought in concentration camps and had to stay there for several years. Although, and that was the complaint that Korematsu issued in his case at the Supreme Court of the United States, although he was just an American citizen who did nothing wrong. So he didn't commit any crime. He didn't do anything. He was not a saboteur. He did not work together with Japanese forces or anything like that. But just because he was Japanese, he was brought into a concentration camp. We will come back to that point a little bit later. So how is it going? The next example that I brought with me is from the Algerian War between France and Algerian Liberation Forces, which led at least to two laws issued by the Assemblée Nationale in France. The one was from 1956. It's La Loi 56-258 from 18th March 1950, which actually, yes, it's some sort of carte blanche, if you want, for the military and government power in Algeria fighting their war of independence to use les pouvoirs les plus étendus. That means all powers possible, and to take all exceptional measure that leads to the rétablissement de l'ordre, that means to re-establish the order. So although this might have been a law that was very much made for the situation in Algeria, the other law above, the 385 from the 3rd of April 1955, is a law for the état d'urgence, that is the French version of the state of exception. And this law still is applied today. That means once you look and have a state of exception or état d'urgence in France, let it be between 84 and 88 with regard to New Caledonia. Let it be 2005. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let it be 2015. All these state of exceptions were based on that very law from 1955. So that is some sort of the functional equivalent to the German Notstand, which is in the German constitution. Here you have that very central law permitting exceptional measures in crisis situation for French government. So that is one thing. You have this law introduced here during a war, used then for also internal crisis situations. And you have one other hint already. You have a state of exception that became necessary during one could say post-colonial war or a war of independence. So post-colonialism obviously plays a role in what we see in France with regard to the use of state of exception. And that picture that you see here is some 50 years later. It's from a suburb in the northeast of Paris, and we had some severe civil unrests in December and January 2005-2006 in Paris after two young men were chased by the police and died later on in a house where they wanted to hide, and that really much resembles to the situations we had not even 1 month ago in France. Although one must say that Emmanuel Macron didn't issue a state of emergency that time. In 2005 they did, and I found a very, very interesting article in the French paper Le Monde, which said that, well, what we do in 2005, what we do today to the people living in the suburbs, which are mainly from Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, what we do to them is exactly the same what we already did to their parents and grandparents during the Algerian War. So also the French public saw some sort of a parallel to that situation of dealing with the consequences of colonialism. In 2015, next state of exception in France, which was the very first one that was not related to post-colonial problems, was the very first one to be related to terrorist attacks. Starting at the very beginning of 2005 in January with the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, and then in November 13th and 14th on the Bataclan, on the Stade de France, and in the 10th and 11th arrondissement in Paris. There we have some sort of a state of exception situation that showed also this tendency of normalization. Normally, a state of exception in France is limited for 6 months. And here it became longer and longer and longer, lasting very first time until July 2016 for the Euro football championship, which was held in France in 2016. Then after that, we already saw the attack at Nice. And then it got longer, and it only ended in 2017 in October. Meanwhile, when the state of exception ended in France, some of its provisions, for example, the possibility of house searches by the police without having a judge to allow this house search, were taken into or adopted by normal French law. Another example that also is very intriguing, very striking, is what we saw in Turkey 2016. In July 2016, we did have the attempted coup of the parts of the Turkish military, and after that, state of exception was issued, which led to a complete fundamental change in the Turkish constitution during the state of exception. That is the state of exception that was once implemented in order to save a constitutional order, to save a state, there was introduced in order to completely change that constitutional order. So there was no getting back to the order as it was before the crisis stroke, but it was some sort of a tool to get rid of a constitution that was perhaps considered not to be that much appropriate for the governing party. Last example, if I may, very briefly, during the corona pandemic, here we have some sort of non-man-made causes, of course, for state of exception. What is worth mentioning anyhow is that in a very, very brief period of time, that is between March and April 2020, more than 100 of approximately 200 states adopted state of emergency measures worldwide. So there one can very much see how much actually the pandemic and the shock of the pandemic stroke governments, and how much, as we read it in the Federalist Papers, fear might want us to get rid of freedoms, at least partially, in order to have more security. So let's just sum it up very quickly. I think what one can say is that the application of state of exception has become more frequent in a global scale, especially after 9/11, during or after the so-called war on terror was declared by George W. Bush. State of exception after the Second World War was not a very frequent phenomenon, but after 9/11, it could be observed more and more often. What one can also observe is that the justification or plausibilization of the friend-enemy distinction, it's us against them, it's we against these terrorists, becomes more and more predominant, also allowing to adopt more and more harsh measures against these people that are not considered to be on the same level, not to be considered as criminals, but really considered as enemies that one might combat with all forces. And what one might say as well as some sort of a third idea of what one could observe, that we have some cases that show, at least in a partial manner, when you look in the situation in France from 2015 to 2017, or that show an almost complete change in democratic political culture due to the state of exception application. That is that although the state of exception was introduced as a remedy for democracy, it perhaps has more and more the tendency towards a more authoritarian institutional setting that it prepares, let's say. All these three things that I mentioned here, these some sort of findings, do really, really need much more research. That is, that we have a very, very great lack of studies that, for example, try to analyze in a comparative perspective, or what are the justifications, what are the words or the arguments or speech figures or whatever used in order to legitimize state of exception. Or if we got to the third point, why is it that some situations are obviously or not more apt for a democratic change, for a change in political culture due towards a more authoritarian regime compared to others? So how is it that we sometimes during a state of emergency lose democratic political culture, and why is it that in other cases we don't lose it? In order to come to an end, I would like to provide you very briefly with some concluding remarks. perhaps also some things that the state of emergency, state of exception analysis should look into. And I want you at the beginning already, I don't have that much answers, but I have very, very many questions. At least two of them are here. The very first question is, if the exception becomes the new normal, what is then normality? What does normality mean? Is there any normality thinkable with regard to democratic rule? Related to that very question is the second one, is are we really facing some sort of an authoritarian shift in global, probably former democratic societies? Is the state of exception a tool to enhance this development? Or when it should be a tool to enhance that way towards authoritarian regimes, to authoritarian institutional settings, what could one adopt strategies or institutional settings that prevent the decay of democracy, that prevent the misuse of state of exception? Or is it that state of exception is somewhat related to racism? Is it that, as we have seen in France, we had from 1955 until 2005, for a 50-year period, always states of exception with relation to post-colonial situation? I brought you here a very brief definition of racism coming from the Cambridge Academic Content Dictionary. And what is the core idea here is that someone is treated unfair because of some assumptions with regard to his or her race. And this unfair treatment is actually the same what we do during a state of emergency. We take someone's rights due to various assumptions, contingent assumptions, that he or she might consider a threat, might be perceived as an enemy, and therefore a state of emergency might be considered as some sort of a legal tool that perhaps not necessarily triggers racist policies, but that does not necessarily prevent them either. And in order to give you a little better idea of what I mean by that, is a citation from the dissent of Justice Robert Jackson from the United States Supreme Court that he issued during the Korematsu versus United States case that I mentioned earlier. The main ruling during the in the case was that it was perfectly legal to get rid of Fred Korematsu and put him into the concentration camp. However, Justice Robert Jackson and others issued dissenting opinions, and here in this dissent from Justice Robert Jackson, you will find what I just said. It's that once you apply this executive order on a certain group of people, and you only do it against them, this is in principle some sort of a racial discrimination against Americans with Japanese ancestry. And I think it's important to see that Robert Jackson here talks about a loaded weapon that is ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need, saying that once you have any argument, anything that is considered to be plausible in the political public, saying that, yes, we have to get rid of Americans with Japanese ancestry, get them into camps, we are there in a very, very racist situation. So let me conclude by a final author that I very briefly wanted to introduce to you. And this author, unfortunately, and in contrast to Carl Schmitt, is mentioned very, very rarely in publications on state of exception. This author is Clinton Rossiter. Clinton Rossiter wrote a book. It was published in 1948. It's about constitutional dictatorship, crisis management, crisis government in modern democracies. And this book is an analysis of state of emergency practices in the Weimar Republic, in the Third French Republic, and in Great Britain. And this is very much, as I would say, a study on state of emergency should be. It should be coming and being inspired from a normative democratic point of view, doing empirical research on how state of exception is applied. And I would like to end with this very sentence that is would, in my opinion, merit to be much more cited in any publication dealing with state of emergency our days. This is what you can find on page 243 in the 1948 edition. And I think this is a sentence that's very true. Constitutional dictatorship, state of exception, is a dangerous thing. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Matthias Lemke. It was an excellent class. No class could be better than that to start our course with our first special class, with this perfect script of the state of exception, who is having the first contact with the subject of his studies. State of exception is knowing today, learning today, many things that are so important to understand the whole development of the state of exception. So once again, I would like to say thank you for this perfect presentation, and the presentation was very clear to our students in Brazil, and we appreciate it a lot too. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, so now we have time to develop some ideas with you, if you don't care. Okay. I would like to emphasize once again that students can send questions and commentaries on chat, via chat. And I would like to start with some commentaries and questions to you. I listed here some topics to discuss with you and develop some more. Starting with the case of Carl Schmitt, that called my attention a lot. Because we know very well Carl Schmitt in Brazil too, I think everywhere in the world, it's very common. But the way you developed the idea called my attention because you mentioned about the way that Carl Schmitt talks about states of exception, but without an empirical study developed. Well, it's a question about, it's more a curiosity. In Brazil, we always refer to Carl Schmitt when we are talking about state of exception. It's a very common thing. But I think that in Brazil, different of Germany, we forget the second part of his life after the Second World War. So we have him as an example of this study, and we let the rest aside. So it's a question of a curiosity to students. What do the German people think about Carl Schmitt and the studies of Carl Schmitt after the Second World War? Because this whole presentation of states of exception appeared especially in the 1920s and 1930s, starting the second decade, 1910s, more or less. And after the Second World War, that he continued to produce a lot. What is the image of Carl Schmitt to German people? I will start with this question that is a curiosity, because we already have questions in the chat that I will transmit to you after.
Thank you very much for this I think very important question, actually. So I think it would go too far to say that there is some sort of perception of Carl Schmitt in a broader German public. I think that's non-existent, because actually Carl Schmitt is some sort of a legal scholar. He's part of some academic discourses, and therefore he is perceived in academia, of course, and also in some political debates, one might say. And actually the debate where Carl Schmitt is mentioned a lot in the recent years is among other authors, one might say, but he's, I think, a very central figure in the discourse and in the development of the political positions of what one calls the new right. That is a political direction that considers itself as extremely conservative, nationalist, in a certain way, anti-pluralist, anti-democratic, as far as one understands that having a democracy means having various perspectives, means having a plurality that then is discussed in the political public in order to find a compromise. So I think Schmitt is, let's say, the spiritus rector for people who would consider themselves to be part of this new right, which is visible, for example, in Austria in form of the so-called Identitäre Bewegung, the identitarian movement, or in Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland, with the AfD. And the people surrounding these political groups. So therefore, I would say that Schmitt is, although he is not in favor of democracy, he is very much discussed in certain political groups and in certain political areas that one might say unfortunately become more and more dominant in our current political and democratic system.
All right. Before the questions that we have in the chat, I would like to comment too that on the other hand, Schmitt is a popular author in Brazil and in the world. The case of Bernard Manin, his name is completely unknown in Brazil. It's a new one that you brought to us. Thank you so much for it. Once again, about the distinctions of man-made and non-man-made causes of a state of exception, which was very clear to understand too. And when you commented about France in 2015, I was living there in the back street of Bataclan. So I lived under urgence, état d'urgence in France in that time. Definitely was not a good experience. Well, so first, I will add to our screen the question of our student Thiago Gomes de Freitas Almeida, that has a question. So a thinker was skipped, and I think he's talking about the case of George Agamben. If you have time, can you come back and talk a little bit about?
Yeah, of course. Actually, I am not a great, so at first, thank you very much for this question, and I think it's very important to at least briefly talk about Agamben as well. Agamben is a theoretical figure, is a philosopher that is very well known, also a figure in not only in the academic realm but also in the political public, who came to publish also some, let's say, interesting ideas during the Corona pandemic. And I think there are at least two things that one might take into account when it comes to Giorgio Agamben and his work. I think the first one is that Agamben sees himself as some sort of a successor of Michel Foucault and his work, namely the idea of biopolitics, that is all the sum of the, let's say, intrinsic mechanisms of power that are implemented into the individual, so therefore it can be reigned better because or it reigns itself. So that is, let's say, the diagnosis of Michel Foucault and his idea of biopolitics. And I think Agamben writes very much in this spirit, saying that he perceives modern society as a place where the individual is not free, where the individual is controlled by many means, where the individual suffers a lot under various exercises of power, let's say. And in the very way he then uses the state of exception as a philosophical notion, as a political notion, he comes to the point where he says that, well, in the end, the state of exception is the manifestation of all that power that is up on the shoulders of each individual, because during a state of exception, it becomes very clear that a government can easily decide whether or not you have rules or where you have rights or you don't have any rights anymore. So for him, the state of exception is some sort of paradigmatic place, a paradigmatic notion of the exercise of pure power by the state against the individual. And he has this famous notion of the homo sacer, which is a man that was free of any rights during the Roman Republic, and that could have been killed any time. This is also a title of his book series from 2002. And therefore, I think Agamben is strong in pointing out that whenever it comes to state of exception, we do have a very, very fundamental issue with fundamental rights. I mentioned during my talk that I think state of exception is all about enhancing the government's capacities of problem solving, giving more authority to the executive. And one might ask oneself, well, when the executive gets more power, and we are talking about a closed ecosystem of the constitution, if one side in this balance of power gets more, who has then less power? And I think this is very, very often clearly visible with regard to fundamental rights that are shifted away from citizens, at least on a temporal basis. And having stressed at least this point, I think is a very important merit to the work of Giorgio Agamben, whereas on the other side, I think how do I say this, his too exaggerated notion of a state of exception, of being pure violence, does not lead us to having an empirical approach that one could pursue in political science. So I hope that it gives you a short idea of my perception of the work of Giorgio Agamben. Yes, he is an important figure in the discourse. I think he highlighted the problem of fundamental rights that come under stress, but on the other hand, I'm not that sure if he is a good starting point for what I think would be crucial when you look at state of emergency or state of exception, that is empirical research.
All right. Thank you, Thiago Almeida, for the question and the commentary. We have another one from Samuel Souza that asks, is it possible to compare the state of exception with what Durkheim considered pathology, taking into account that the state of exception is not normality?
Mm-hmm. First, I have to admit that I'm not really aware of what Durkheim considered a pathology. I'm not quite sure if the exception is, let's say, some sort of a pathologic, let's say, phase during or within a democratic constitutional regime. I think the exception is not sort of an illness or so, but the exception is meant to be a tool. The exception is meant, or the state of exception is meant to be a tool set, is meant to be an instrument in order to get rid of a problem. So therefore, I'd say the crisis one might consider as the pathology, whereas the state of exception is more the medicine, if you want. The interesting thing is then, why does the medicine state of exception turn against democracy, which it should help to get rid of the crisis? But I'm very sorry, I'm not aware really of that notion of pathology as it is used by Durkheim. So I would have to look that up and would have to come back to that later. Sorry.
Okay. One more. Thank you, Samuel, for your question, Samuel Souza. And now we have a long question from Maria Gabriela Carvalho that starts like that. I also have a question. In the paper we had to read for today's class, you said that a study about the state of exception should take into account also the political discourse.
Yeah.
Perpetrated not only by the politicians themselves, but also by the media about the necessity or not of a state of exception. What would you say is essential to pay attention to in these discourses, so we don't fall into fallacies that mask second intentions, for example, unjust persecutions? And she continues. More than that, would you say that a state of exception is really necessary in times of crisis, or could our political and legislative bureaucracies could find a more efficient way to deal with crises without the tendencies to monopolize power? That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's actually two very important questions. When I come to the first one, when I mean analyzing the political discourse, what for me is important to have a look, and what I did myself in my works as well, is to look at least, let's say, a broader political discourse, which is, for example, visible in newspaper texts, or radio diffusions, or television or so. And what one could describe as a more narrow political discourse, which is, for example, parliamentary debates. And within these debates, I think what one should try to figure out is what are not necessarily the arguments or the isolated arguments, if there are any, but what are the language patterns or the speech patterns that are used? Meaning, for example, do you have what we were talking about in the presentation? Do you have some sort of a friend-enemy distinction that is made up? Or do you have, for example, some sort of a efficiency talk saying that one needs more efficiency in order to solve problems or to enhance problem-solving capacity, which is in democracy perhaps not that efficient, but the question is also, must it be that efficient? So efficiency is some sort of a language pattern, a speech pattern that one might search and will find certainly in public discourse. And the other point, I think it's important, besides these speech patterns, or these speech patterns, to look not just necessarily for arguments in the sense Jürgen Habermas would presume they are there in a democratic discourse, which is a very reasoned discourse. But when you look into the recent developments in the political public, you will find that it's not necessarily the one with the best argument to win a discourse, but certainly the one who screams the loudest. So therefore, I would always suggest to find, and therefore I'm not talking about argumentation, but about plausibilization, to find sentences that unfold legitimacy in the political public. And these sentences do not necessarily have to be arguments. So I think, I hope that clears it up a little bit more, in order to understand what I would look for when I look into the political discourse. And yeah, is there a more effective way of problem solving? I don't know. in general, one might say that problem solving once it comes to larger catastrophes, we saw the picture of the inundations in Hamburg in 1962. This is always a very, very complex process. And when I look at what German government does in the recent, I don't know, 10, 15 years, it's always a tendency towards more centralization of crisis reaction capacities. Although Germany is, for example, is a federal state that has very, very different regions, and these regions have very, very different also geographical, topological, etc., conditions. So the question is, why do we always tend towards centralization when it comes to problem solving? Besides that, the vast majority of German personnel, for example, in the fire brigades or in other institutions that are there for crisis relief, they don't do it professional, but they are there in some sort of besides their job. That means they do it. They do not get paid for that, but they are just simply there. They are citizens, and they are doing this citizen job. And perhaps it would be helpful to strengthen these people, to strengthen people that invest their free time, their time after their job, in order to help others to have, let's say, to regain the idea that defending in any means your society, your democratic society, is a fundamental democratic job. And therefore, it's also important not only to participate in the political discourse or to participate in elections, but also to put a fire out in your neighbor's house.
Very well. Good question from Maria Gabriela Garfalho. And now we have one more, João Pedro Azevedo Teodoro. Would you say that Venezuela is today a state of exception, democracy, or a dictatorship?
Unfortunately, I'm not enough aware of the situation in Venezuela. Actually, in my books, I draw a lot of attention to the situation in the United States, in France. I worked a lot on Germany, Spain, the Marshall Islands. Actually, I looked into Turkey as well, but I never did a detailed study on Venezuela, unfortunately. But I think it would be worth, regarding that question, to have a look into that. So I'm sorry that I can't elaborate more on that issue, because I'm just not sufficiently aware of the situation in Venezuela. I'm sorry for that.
Okay, so Professor, I would like to ask you one thing before we finish and before another questions. I realized that you skipped the case of a state of siege in France Constitution from 1791. And that French Constitution created a tradition of state of exception based on this specific institution called the state of siege. In Brazil's case, for example, is full of cases of the state of siege, especially in our first republic from 1891 to 1930, the Constitution of 1891. We had several cases of uses of state of siege in Brazil, and it contributed a lot to the development of democracy in our country. So I would like to ask you, what would you say about the cases of state of siege and the institution of the state of siege in this whole comprehension of state of exception?
Yeah, actually, when I was talking about these examples of France, I was very incomplete. Actually, I just presented you one of let's say 3 state of emergency or state of exception policies or provisions. The one that I mentioned was the law from 3rd April 1955, which contains the État d'urgence, which was, by the way, completed in 2021, I think it was, we don't only have the état d'urgence, but also the état d'urgence sanitaire, that is the health emergency during the pandemic. Besides that, one can look in the French Constitution from 1958, and one will find two other models, let's say, or ideas or provisions of state of exception, or that relate to state of exception. One is in Article 16. It's, I think, the state of siège there, and the other one is in Article 36. It's les pleins pouvoirs du président de la République, that is the authorities of the president of the French Republic. And what we already mentioned about the American president being some sort of a, not dictator, but a monarch, more or less, that has all the power in his hands and the authority to do the right things at the right time once they are necessary, is certainly also true about the French president with the plein pouvoir du président. The state of siege is, from the historical idea, is some sort of, you're in the castle and the enemy troops are surrounding your castle and you can't get out anymore and they can't yet go in. And therefore, I didn't mention it because in my perception, state of siege is more war-related or wartime-related, or related to a situation where an attack is ongoing that has at least two different parties involved that come with a certain number of combatants that goes far beyond of what we see during, let's say, normal terrorist attacks. So therefore, I didn't mention it, but you are certainly right that the state of siege, as well as les pleins pouvoirs du président de la République for the French case, as well as the law of 1955, do belong to, let's say, the tool set of crisis reaction mechanisms as they are foreseen by the Constitution and by the laws of the Fifth French Republic.
All right, thank you. Well, so would you like to comment anything else, Professor?
Do you have any questions left?
No, we don't have more questions from the students.
Okay, great.
My questions too.
No, but thank you very much for these questions, which are always helpful for me. For example, with regard to Durkheim or the Venezuela situation, to see my blind spots as well, and that will help me to figure out some more details on Venezuela and the notion of pathology in Durkheim's work. So thank you therefore as well. Thank you.
Pretty well. So I would like, before we finish, I would like to highlight once again your contacts and your website, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Let me push it here and highlight it. So here are some contacts of Professor Matthias Lemke, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Twitter is not the current logo, but I couldn't fix it anymore because Elon Musk changed it yesterday, and I wouldn't change it certainly the next month, just to have a small protest on that. Sorry.
Perfect. Very well. So thank you once again, Professor Matthias Lemke. I will finish with the commentary of Maria Gabriela Carvalho. It was very enlightening. She was saying thank you to for your answer, and people are saying it here in the chat too. Thank you a lot for your class. Professor Matthias Lemke was very kindly accepted the invitation to start our classes, our special classes here too, and offered one text of him to be read during our course. So it was very, very enlightening. For sure, who had the first contact with this matter of state of exception learned the most important points that are necessary to know and to understand what is a state of exception. And I would like to emphasize that Professor Matthias Lemke is very welcome in Brazil the next time, for sure.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Yeah.
Minas Gerais, and thank you for the class once again. Thanks for all the students that were here with us, remembering that the attendance list is available yet, just for more 10 minutes. And tomorrow we have our second special class with Professor Nomi-Claire Lazar from University of Ottawa in Canada, that will talk about better timing some arrhythmias of climate emergency, and continue to develop the studies of state of emergency. Thanks for everything, and thanks for everyone. Professor Matthias Lemke, see you later, and all the other students continue to follow our studies. See you on the class tomorrow. Bye-bye, and good afternoon in Brazil. Good evening in Germany.
Thank you. Bye.